Hi, welcome to everybody. It's very nice to see you here for the Humanitas. This is the inaugural Visiting Professorship in Statecraft and Diplomacy, which will be running for the next 5 years, we hope. And it's a great pleasure, once again. My name is Simon Goldfield. I'm the director of CRASSH, if you're wondering who I am. It's a great pleasure, once again, to be able to thank the Institute for Strategic Dialogue for help setting up the Humanitas series. And it's great fun to have one of the directors, Sir Andreasen, here in the front row, and to thank them all for making this series possible. And it's an extraordinary pleasure for us to be able to welcome Helen Clark, who's Administrator of the United Nations Development Programme, Chair of the United Nations Development Group, and the former Prime Minister of New Zealand. And there's going to be 2 lectures in the series, tonight at 5 o'clock as you're here, and tomorrow at 5. And there's a seminar tomorrow at 10 o'clock, to which everybody is invited. There's a programme circulating if you wish. You don't need tickets, you can come for that. And that'll be a chance for further discussion. Tonight, for the first time, we're trying also a live feed and Twitter. So you can ask your questions on Twitter via the hashtag DEV21. That's the first time I've said that sentence, and it doesn't feel very good in the mouth, but I'm sure it will work. And afterwards, everybody's invited to a drinks reception. Without further ado, I hope you'll join me in welcoming Helen Clark to give the Humanitas Lectureship in Statecraft and Diplomacy.
Thank you, Professor Goldhill, ladies and gentlemen, and it's a pleasure to be invited to be the inaugural Visiting Professor in Statecraft and Diplomacy. And can I particularly acknowledge the Institute for Strategic Dialogue and Angelica Diekman for the generous support which has made the chair possible. Also acknowledge Sir Richard Dearlove, Chair of the Standing Committee, who persuaded me that I should come to Cambridge. And thank you all for attending. On an occasion like this, I usually start with some disclaimers. I've come here to talk about aspects of development. Of course, I'm not a development academic. Some 3 decades ago, I left my position as a teacher in political science at Auckland University, and I spent most of the next 30 years involved in politics in my country. Member of Parliament for 27.5 years and 9 years as Prime Minister. But 3 years ago, I came up to New York to head the UN Development Programme, and what goes with that is also chairing the UN Development Group of funds, programmes and agencies, which taken all together probably account for throughput of around 20% of the world's official development assistance, which is not an insignificant amount. So for the 2 lectures, I decided I'd explore the concept of resilience in one, and then look at issues around sustainable development in the run-up to Rio Plus 20, which occurs in June, in the second. And I thought I would take the resilience concept first because building it is about sustaining development. And I thought I would draw a fine distinction between sustaining development and sustainable development, although the two are, of course, intrinsically very interconnected. So let me start then with the assertion, which can be backed by factual evidence, that today our world population, taken as a whole, is healthier, wealthier and better educated than ever before. And as the target date for achieving the goals set in the Millennium Development Goals approaches, we can see that we're within reach of every child being enrolled in a primary school and many fewer lives being lost to poverty, hunger and disease. Goals and targets in these areas are central to the Millennium Development Goal concept. And these goals have been, in my opinion, to quite a large extent successful in generating political leadership, broad partnerships and civic engagement for development, and most importantly, in getting results. When you focus, you often do have a better chance of getting results. The preliminary data for 2010, which the World Bank is now making available, suggests that the MDG targets, which were set for halving the number of people who live in extreme poverty and of those who live without access to safe drinking water, have already been met ahead of the 2015 target date. We can also see that the MDG targets set for achieving gender parity in primary education and reducing child mortality are close to being achieved. The total number of children out of school fell by around a third during the last decade. And we've seen some progress on key environmental objectives. The global conventions on climate change, on biodiversity, and on combating desertification, all a legacy of the 1992 Earth Summit, have come into effect. However, to immediately qualify, behind these achievements, there are disconcerting realities. Many people still live in extreme poverty, even where economies are rapidly growing. Rapid GDP growth does not automatically equate with poverty reduction. Over 20% of the world's population lives in states which can be considered as somewhat fragile and highly vulnerable to a range of shocks. Our global economic and financial systems remain rather volatile. Every time one thinks the Eurozone crisis is behind us, turn on BBC again, and it's there. Armed violence and organised criminal networks are growing sources of threats to human security in many countries, and our planet is under considerable stress. Climate-related disasters are increasing in frequency, scale and scope in rich and poor countries alike. We see nearly 40% of the global landmass already degraded due to soil erosion, reduced fertility of soil and overgrazing. And on current patterns of use, and as our global population expands as expected, the stress on these ecosystems is certainly not going to lessen. So one could say that the threats to the world we live in and the challenges to development are rather great. And we need to step up the political, social, economic, technological tools and our policies to address these challenges. There is a new global report out which very much underlines the importance of doing this. And it is the report from the United Nations Secretary General's high-level panel on global sustainability, called, most appropriate for this lecture, Resilient People and Resilient Planet, a Future Worth Choosing. And it says, quote, "We need to change dramatically, beginning with how we think about our relationship to each other, to future generations, and the ecosystems which support us." And it states that, quote, "Continuing on the same path will put people and our planet at greatly heightened risk." So that global panel urged a focus on sustainable development as an extraordinary opportunity to build human well-being, to further global justice, to strengthen gender equity and preserve our planet's life support systems for future generations. Among the recommendations it made, it calls on countries to build up and enhance resilience by strengthening social protection systems, disaster risk reduction, and adaptation to climate change. But I think the report could have gone further by putting building resilience as being at the very heart of the Sustainable Development Agenda. Sustainable development also needs to be sustained development, and resilience goes beyond the ability to deal with shock to the very foundations of governance and institutions. At UNDP, we tend to see the development challenges of this century as rather different in nature, scale and scope from in the past. If our world is to be one which eradicates poverty, reduces inequality, where growth is inclusive and production and consumption do not exceed planetary boundaries, if we are to be effective in combating climate change, then we need to look beyond the traditional interventionist logic to harness the agency of people, their communities and their institutions. And it is this logic which has led our organisation to encapsulate its mission statement in a simple phrase, empowered lives, resilient nations, which speaks to both means and ends, as empowered people can and do build resilient nations and communities. So we're talking about a resilience-based approach, offering a comprehensive basis for achieving sustainable development. We're saying that while we move forward on sustainable development, it is critical to look at what has been achieved so far and make sure that those gains are protected. That people, their infrastructures, their communities, their institutions need to be equipped to withstand external shocks, whatever those shocks may be. When in Singapore recently giving a lecture, I spoke on the importance of governance for sustainable development, saying that the latter is not attained nor sustained if the quality of governance is poor. And it could be poor either because a state's institutions lack capacity or are undermined by corruption or abuse of authority, or because the state itself is so fragile that it cannot give effective leadership or guidance on policy of any kind. So building resilience for sustained and sustainable development will, in my view, benefit from governance which is not only active, but also honest, effective and fair, and I think responsive and representative as well. Coming from New Zealand, one speaks from a deep conviction that resilience is development. I think back on the history of my own country, where a dominant theme has been a quest for security, resilience to adversity. And indeed, that very phrase, the quest for security, was the title of a book by the prominent economist Dr. W.B. Such on New Zealand's search for social and economic security, written in 1942. As a small nation far distant from all major markets, except Australia, and dependent on export returns from commodities whose prices fluctuated wildly, New Zealand put in place a social protection system after the Great Depression which prevented its people ever again experiencing outright destitution. And around the world at the same time, other nations were building such systems, whether we think of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal, the social protection systems of Scandinavia, or what happened in Britain after World War II. And while some of these systems have been better maintained than others, I think we can conclude that overall they have been successful in maintaining higher levels of social cohesion and human development than would have been possible without them. But not all developed countries kept systemic resilience to economic shock. The era of deregulation and poor oversight by supervisory institutions then exposed not only their own economies, but also the global economy to a massive shock from which we have not yet had a full recovery. The United States Congress set up a Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission, which reported that, quote, "The crisis was the result of human actions and inaction, not of Mother Nature or computer models gone haywire. A crisis of this magnitude need not have occurred." So before I reflect on why building resilience needs to be at the forefront of the development agenda in developing countries, I want to underline that systemic resilience to shocks is critical for nations at every level of development, unless they are prepared to see years of human development and progress literally wiped away when adversity strikes. And that was surely a lesson we should all have learned from the Great Depression. So let me go a little more into the thinking underlying resilience-based approaches and talk about some of the core principles which could be applied. And I'll start with a little word on what I understand to be the origins of the concept of resilience, developed in the discipline of psychology in relation to how individuals cope with stress and adversity. Such coping can result in an individual bouncing back to a previous state of normal functioning, or the experience of exposure to adversity may produce what I understand is called a stealing effect, which leads to better functioning than might have been expected in such difficult circumstances. For the UN Development Programme, we see achieving resilience as a transformative process which needs to build on and draw on the innate strength of individuals, their communities, and their institutions to prevent and mitigate and learn from the experience of shocks of any type, internal or external, natural or man-made, economic, health-related, political or social. In development circles, we often see the concept of resilience arising in the context of disaster risk reduction, and the term can be used interchangeably with that of adaptation, but I don't think it's the same. We see adaptation as a process of responding to changed circumstances or to specific anticipated events. Resilience, though, implies the inherent capacity of a system to deal with whatever is thrown at a society, no matter how well anticipated or how surprising that may be. Adaptation obviously features quite prominently in the dialogue around tackling climate change. And we see the frequency, the scale and the transnational nature of climate-related disasters increasing. So building capacities of countries to adapt to the impact of those disasters is seen as a realistic complement to ongoing national and global prevention and mitigation measures. But note the emphasis on realistic. The UN Convention on Climate Change itself identifies adaptation as a second best response option to mitigation. A key weakness of an adaptation approach is the implicit assumption that threats and consequent impacts are inevitable, and that can detract from a focus on prevention. If one were to apply an adaptation approach to shocks like conflict and armed violence, or those of an economic nature, it becomes even more problematic, as it would surely never be accepted as reasonable just to adapt to the menace of armed violence, conflict, or war. Everywhere such acts occur, they set back development, they make progress difficult, they tear societies apart, cause great loss of life, and undermine legitimate government. As well, armed violence diverts resources away from critical development tasks like poverty reduction and many others, and into the security sector. And if one takes the example of Guatemala, armed violence there cost the equivalent of 7.3% of GDP in 2005, which far outstripped the country's spending on either health or education. We could apply similar logic to adaptation relative to economic shocks. If we only adapt to their onslaught rather than addressing the underlying causes, we would surely be rather missing the point. So we think there's a need to go far beyond adaptation and to build systemic capacities of societies, both to prevent and to ameliorate the adverse consequences of shocks. First priority, prevention, complemented by explicit efforts to reduce societal vulnerabilities and a commitment to maintain the integrity of communities, institutions and ecosystems. Those are the very foundations of resilience. Resilience-based development also invokes the agency of people and their institutions and systems. It calls for developing the agency or the capacity of the poor to overcome their conditions, drawing on local knowledge and expertise, and the resilience of those who are vulnerable. It's about building capacities of societies to prevent, resolve, learn, and grow. It's about replenishing and regenerating innate capacity. So on some of the core principles underlying this, let me start with needing to respect specific contexts. International development circles often talk a lot about respect for context specificity, but we don't always see a serious commitment to it. If the aim really is to foster resilience, then more than lip service is required, more than applying standard templates. Development initiatives do need to be based on deep and genuine analyses of the specific context. Second core principle, resilience-based development requires respect for national ownership. We do see traditional donor-recipient relations being challenged, and they need to be. And they need to be replaced with respectable partnerships where developing countries are in the driver's seat. Resilience is a consequence of experience and learning. It is about capacity for self-organisation and renewal, and none of that can be achieved if development partners attempt to do the work for countries and communities rather than walking with them as they undertake the hard work themselves. This was a very clear message which came from the Busan High-Level Forum on Aid Effectiveness last year. A plea, use our systems, help us build our national systems, don't go round the back of them. The third principle, that resilience-based sustainable development needs to be comprehensive in its nature and requires integrated responses to complex challenges. The report of the Secretary-General's High-Level Panel on Global Sustainability reaffirms that integrated policy making, planning and budgeting are very powerful tools for driving coherence across institutions and societies, and that's vital for building systemic resilience. This need for more strategic and coherent planning in states considered fragile was also raised at the Busan Forum late last year. And UNDP has been very active in these discussions with a group of nations who call themselves the G7+, small G7+. They are countries, including Timor-Leste, which have acknowledged their own fragility and have developed what's called a New Deal with international partners to support their transformation into capable and resilient states. We see so many of the 21st century shocks having profound implications beyond the state boundaries within which they initially occurred. So comprehensive responses require us to look cross-border, cross regions, and in the case of the global economy, multilaterally. If we took the situation in the region of the Sahel right now, which could be described as the perfect storm, it is an example of precisely a challenge which requires cross-border and cross-sectoral responses. Drought, hunger, conflict, instability, they're all there. In February, I travelled to Niger with Valerie Amos, the UN's Emergency Relief Coordinator, precisely to show a joint commitment between the humanitarian and development arms of the UN to working together on the region's food insecurity problems, which are extreme. And we think that if we put resilience at the centre of the response, we can also find a way to close the old divide between humanitarian and development actors. Fourth principle for these approaches, committing to continual innovation and learning. To renew out of adversity, a culture of learning needs to be embraced. Empowering people with knowledge and the capacity to mobilise can overcome or it can significantly mitigate adversity, notwithstanding great scale and magnitude. I will just briefly mention Mozambique before coming back to it in a few moments, where in response to previous great disaster with loss of life, the development partners working with the government stepped up resilience response strategies. And investments like these pay huge dividends. I'm well aware from extensive disaster risk reduction measures in my own country, which is vulnerable to the entire range, I think, of natural disasters from earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, tsunamis, and extreme weather events, just how important investment in resilience is and learning from what has happened before. The fifth and final principle I wanted to mention for action is the need for long-term and strategic engagement. It does require international support, which is not quick and dirty, but incremental and enduring. Supporting nations to become more resilient is a long-term task. Short-term projectised development support does little to build resilience. It's the long-term engagement which counts, and also working out very carefully where the resources should be spent, not spreading them thinly in a scattershot way, but really looking for catalytic effect and what will be the most transformative. So to come back to the Mozambique and to other examples, think back 12 years. Mozambique was hit by huge flooding after a cyclone. It left 800 people dead, 500,000 people homeless, and it disrupted the livelihoods of over 1 million more people. Around 4.5 million people were affected. 2007, floods of similar magnitudes hit again. This time, the death toll was 29 people, not 800, and the numbers displaced were some 70,000 people, not 500,000. Think back to the Boxing Day tsunami of 2004, which affected Aceh in Indonesia. The fatalities there amounted to 4% of its population. Compare that with an earthquake and tsunami of similar magnitude which struck Japan last year, resulting in a death toll only 10% of that in Aceh. Both cases present insights into notions of resilience. When Mozambique was hit the second time, just a few years later, it had already taken a lot of steps to address its resilience. The government provided leadership, had and continues to have a clear strategic vision for building resilience. The development partners provided support for its plans. It worked at the community level, it strengthened its emergency response systems, improved its infrastructure. Civil society and the Red Cross movement were involved, all helped build preparedness. And importantly, both the central government institutions and the local ones had coherent response strategies working together. So Mozambique invested in learning from the adversity that had struck and became much better prepared. Second, resilience is about being able to face adversity without losing the essence of a system. Unlike Aceh, where the tsunami disrupted all vital functions of the society on Boxing Day, Japan, in the face of disaster, retained to a large extent its institutional and organisational structure and has a high capacity to rebound from catastrophe. Third, as I mentioned with respect to Mozambique, it helps in all these cases where the national and the local levels of government are well coordinated. The resilience has to be comprehensive across those levels and across the sectors. But that brings me to make some comments about the importance of the institutions of governance and why they are important for building resilience. Take rule of law institutions, which the UN in its various forms does a lot of work on. Important for fighting crime, important for protecting citizens, important for reinforcing social contracts, important for enabling the environment required for economic recovery after conflict, providing deterrence to future violence, providing a firm foundation for future economic development. When state institutions cannot guarantee access to justice, cannot provide an enabling environment in which people and communities can flourish, then communities do become more vulnerable in many ways, including to criminal or other violent entities which will fill any void that is left. For these kinds of reasons, the World Bank's 2011 World Development Report was making a strong case for building resilient state institutions in fragile states so that access to security, justice, jobs and livelihoods can be improved. Now, to build this, we need good analytical tools. We need to understand better the relations between institutions and the people they serve, the leaders who manage them, the institutional environment, all context-specific again. And this emphasises systems thinking, taking the institutional environment as our point of reference. Institutions don't survive, they won't thrive, if we focus on their technical development without considering the context in which they have to operate. So, core to the work of our organisation, which has a mandate to work in the whole governance area, it's about strengthening institutions and processes which are needed to build trust, improve responsiveness, and ensure networks or systems of institutions and accountability are there which can advance resilience and thereby sustain development. An example I'd give here is El Salvador, where a lot of work has been done with local authorities to design citizen security and social cohesion plans. Aim being to extend the reach of law enforcement, improve responses to criminal incidents, and involve close cooperation with civil society and communities. Now, clearly the job is far from done. El Salvador has had elections recently where the key issue was citizen insecurity. The rate of homicide and violence is extremely high. One of the areas we worked on was establishing gun-free zones in 20 of the most violent municipalities there. And in those zones, there was, over time, a 12% reduction in the homicide rate, a 40% reduction in assaults, a 21% increase in the seizure of weapons, and a 7% increase in theft reports. We've extended that program last year, and in one of the new municipalities added, the rate of homicide reduction recorded was 40%. So if you really go after these issues with good programs, you can get results. But let me move to say a word about the importance of building social protection systems as another very important investment in resilience-based sustainable development, to shield the most vulnerable from the worst effects of shocks and help prevent irreversible development setbacks. And I repeat, these are the steps many nations we now call developed took in the 1930s and the 1940s. We've seen in a number of developing countries during the food, financial and economic crises of recent years how social protection systems have really proved their value. Where they were in place, they had a measurable impact in helping the poor cope with the impact of the global crisis, for example, by enabling families to keep their children in school and be able to access important health services. And one I'll specifically single out is Mexico, with a program which is called Opportunities, one of the largest social protection and cash transfer systems anywhere in the world, covering around 20 million people in a total population of 110 million. They pay all the benefits to the women in the receiving households, and there are additional benefits for women-headed households. It's a program which includes kindergarten access of benefit both to the children and to the women who wish to take up paid work. It provides over 5 million scholarships, and it provides a payment for environmental services funding mostly reforestation works undertaken by Indigenous communities. And the thinking behind that component is that the rest of society should support those who live in and help preserve Mexico's forests. Oportunidades became the flagship of the counter-cyclical policies in Mexico during the crisis. When the financial crisis spilled over there, it suffered a significant loss of jobs and GDP decline of 7%. But poverty did not increase because of Oportunidades. Severe poverty actually dropped marginally, and the program improved access to education and health services. So while the income of the poor suffered from the recession, the in-kind income actually increased. We maintain across the UN development system that basic social protection systems are eminently affordable and build resilience. The International Labour Organization estimates that the cost of putting in place an adequate social protection floor is around 1% to 2% of GDP. But currently, only around 20% of the world's working age population, mostly in middle and upper income countries, has access to comprehensive social protection systems. So this is clearly an area that needs more support. Now, state fragility is a function of not only weak institutions, but also of social systems under strain. Resilient states need an anchor in cohesive societies, and stark inequalities and inequities undermine that. We also see resilient societies as those which have a capacity for tolerance and for dialogue and are able to mediate their differences. They need to exhibit social and civic trust, enabling people to feel included and encouraged to work together. Now, it can be hard work to establish these attributes in any society, but it's even more difficult to do it in societies which have been racked by conflict and by violence. In these cases, fragility can overwhelm institutions and systems. When we look back at the post-election violence in Kenya in 2007, we see a very important lesson about putting in place what we can call infrastructure for peace based on social cohesion. Communities where there was greater cohesion across the ethnic groups experienced far less violence than those without it. Our organisation was associated with the establishment of local peace committees in many places, and where they were functioning, the peace either held during those very, very tense times or it was quickly able to be re-established. We've been working quite a lot over the last decade on this kind of peace infrastructure. And without going into detail, we see it as being about deepening social networks, supporting societies to develop a shared sense of identity and civic engagement, and strengthening democratic values. An example, again, comes from Guyana. Up until 2001, the national elections in Guyana had always seen interethnic tension and violence. Go back 9 years, the government, and we worked with it, launched a comprehensive social cohesion program. They wanted to strengthen community-level mediation, create a national space for dialogue, and enlist both civil society and the media as partners in improving social cohesion. The 2006 election, 3 years later, was peaceful for the first time, and that has been attributed to the program. The 2011 election, despite pre-poll tension, was also peaceful. So the investment in that infrastructure for peace paid off. Another example of a society which has been able to hang together in very tense times around polls is that of Senegal. It approached national elections in February with storm clouds hovering over. Large numbers of unemployed youth were mobilised for political purposes, An incumbent was seen as trying to exceed his constitutional remit, and there was polarisation and tension increasing across the political spectrum. But Senegal's resilience, with some 40 years of running democratic elections, won the day. And again, the development partners were helpful, but the leadership has to come from within the country as it did. There was a platform of women leaders who were advocating publicly for peace, serving as intermediaries among political levels. When the first round of the national polling was peaceful, the public confidence in the constitutional process was restored. Previously quarrelling political parties joined hands, and the citizen groups stepped up to advocate for peaceful polls. That second round led not only to a convincing result, but also a victory for Senegalese democracy and really a show of what resilience had been built in the country. Come now to building social resilience in a more broader sense, through collective action, collaboration, and building partnerships and communities. And in this respect, I wanted to mention Ethiopia's Productive Safety Net program, reaching over 8 million beneficiaries in 300 food insecure districts, providing cash and food in return for work done by communities on environmental conservation, water source protection, and terracing. Through this program, which obviously has environmental benefits, it's also had benefits for the food intake of people. The calorie intake is up 19%, with many people faring better during the 2008 drought and high food price conditions than did households who hadn't been able to be in such a program. It creates significant community assets which have a positive impact beyond the household level. The legitimacy of local government authorities is strengthened by their involvement in setting the priorities for the initiatives and working with the communities. So many examples like this of building this kind of infrastructure. How do we step up resilience-based approaches then? The notion of the environmental or global commons and of systems thinking has been somewhat successfully promoted through the sustainable development paradigm, and that must continue. But pursuing a resilience-based approach to sustainable development does mean significant changes in current global development paradigms and the tools we are using. The power to design pathways to development does need to shift to those who know the context most intimately, and that is communities themselves. The number of voices which are championing resilience as a policy instrument for sustainable development is growing, and the United Kingdom is one of the champions. Last year, the Secretary of State for International Development, Andrew Mitchell, invited me to co-chair with him a political champions group to promote a resilience-based response to climate and natural disaster-related crises. I've been in to see the Secretary of State today and said today's lecture is part of being a political champion. DFID has a new strategy, Building Stability Overseas Strategy, which aims to embed promoting resilience in all its overseas humanitarian and development support programs by 2015. Other humanitarian and development actors, including Australia, Denmark, Germany, Sweden, the World Bank, have developed or are also developing their own resilience-based strategies for sustainable development. In the UN, apart from our own work and that of many other funds, programs and specialised agencies, the Secretary-General has a second-term 5-year action agenda which includes taking action to build the resilience of communities and nations, whether they be experiencing food crises, external economic or financial shocks, and strengthening resilience in emergency settings. My conclusion must be that one does not build resilience overnight. Thinking back to the experience of my own country, it takes time. The impressive reduction in climate disaster-related mortality in countries like Mozambique and Bangladesh must also be mentioned, has taken a decade or more of continued effort. But even so, there are aspects of disaster risk reduction in such countries which will require a lot more work in the years to come, including in Bangladesh on seismic risk. The planning cycles for development partners have tended to be rather short-term. But as I stressed earlier, a core principle of this approach must be long-term, strategic, sustained engagement. Funding over these longer-term frameworks is paramount. And I know from the point of view of our own work, which requires a long-term focus and sustained engagement, short-term funding does constrain the effectiveness of what one can do. Applying a resilience lens to all aspects of development, from poverty reduction to governance, to conflict prevention, to peace building, state building, this requires more research, requires testing of concept, requires new forms of partnership. But I think applying this approach is going to be very critical for meeting current development challenges. And this approach does offer opportunities to build development from the bottom up, from a concern and a deep respect for the people who are always the most resilient in the face of crisis, and that is those who are facing it and confronting it themselves. I think through this approach around resilience, there's an opportunity to seek synergies between the work of humanitarians and development actors, draw on our comparative advantages, and commit to more integrated and coordinated responses. If resilience is to be truly integrated into development agendas, we're going to need political commitment at every level, the national, the local and the global, and we need to invest in it. I think the Rio Plus 20 conference, which I will say more on tomorrow evening, can certainly set a direction which is helpful in this. But of course, commitments that countries make at international conferences have to be followed by actions. And in the political champions group for resilience, we are emphasising that there is an urgent need to invest in resilience-based programs and to match early warning with early action. Take again this perfect storm in the Sahel and the food insecurity aspect of it. Actually, there's been quite a lot of investment in resilience and early warning systems, and the warnings have been going out since last August. The cash slowly trickles in to meet the need which has been anticipated for many months. If it doesn't come in, I think you get a sense of despair. We've done all the work, we've put in the investment, we've got the warning systems, but then nobody came. And that obviously must be avoided. So, in conclusion, I think committing to building resilience offers a way for people everywhere to be equipped with capacity to cope, to act, and to rise to what are often quite daunting challenges. Building resilience is the best chance we have of locking in progress made to date and advancing equitable and sustainable human development. Thank you.